Welcome back to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. In this episode, we will be continuing our exploration of that great Old English epic poem, Beowulf. First, by looking at the various ways it has been translated into modern English by scholars and poets, and then by examining how some modern writers and filmmakers have adapted the poem to make it part of popular culture. I'm so pleased to have back as my co-host my old friend, well, not actually all that old, but one of my very favorite Anglo-Saxon historians in the entire world, Professor Chrissy Senecal. Chrissy?
Thank you so much for having me back.
This will be fun.
All right, So here we go. Talking about translation.
As you said, there are hundreds of works that either are translations or adaptations of Beowulf. I know that Wikipedia has listed 70, and now there's 71 translations. Well, first of all, why do you think there's so many translations?
That's a great question. I think that is a good question. I want to hear your answer. I think part of the answer is that this is a poem with unique language. And so our language changes so much and our audience changes so much. We're not reading it in the original. And to read it in a translation done in the middle of the 20th century is really a different experience and a different kind of poem than one you read from a different approach. And what do you think, though, Richard? Why do you think it's been translated?
I think that it's partly because it's been seen as the beginning of English literature.
Yeah, sure thing.
And I can see why it became so popular in the 19th century, because that was the period in which the Anglo-Saxons had become popular.
Right.
It's part of the cult of the Anglo-Saxons to do the translations from Old English. The first translation of Beowulf into modern English was by John Mitchell Kemble in 1837, which happened to be also the first year of Queen Victoria's reign. By Victoria's death in 1901, there were 10 modern English translations of the poem, most of them word for word, and most of them with an archaic vocabulary, scattered with thous, ye, dost, didst, and the like.
Right.
And so I think it's partly its place at that very beginning of English lit, and it's because it's a challenge to translate.
Oh my, is it a challenge? Oh my, yes, because we were talking earlier, and I translated the fight between Grendel and his mother in graduate school, and it took me hours and hours. And by the time I was done, I looked around me. I finally felt like I had understood it and done a pretty good job. And then I realized it was just trash. It was nothing I would give to any of my students to read. And it just gives me, it's like when you take painting lessons and then you look at a Michelangelo and you realize, oh, there's real art. Those are the people who really can do it.
Well, as somebody who's an Anglo-Saxon historian, I immediately think in terms of, and especially somebody who's a biographer of King Alfred, I think of Alfred's introduction, his preface to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, where he said that it was, we talked about it with my advisors, basically my court scholars, and then I tried to translate it, sometimes word for word, sometimes sense for sense.
Right.
And it brings up an interesting problem with translation.
Especially poetry.
Yes. I say that I've read Dante's Divine Comedy.
Right.
I've read translations of Dante's different. Divine Comedy.
Yeah.
I've read the Iliad. Nope. I've read translations of the Iliad.
The Aeneid, for me, I've read parts of the Aeneid. The Bible.
Aeneid, in class.
I haven't read the Bible. Nope. I've read English translations.
And translations are not the original. There's a gap between them, and translators always have to make a decision. A decision is, what am I trying to get out of this? Am I trying to get the literal meaning of it? Am I trying to tell the story as it appears there? Or am I trying to capture some of the poetry, some of the art, some of the aesthetics of the original? Or am I reconceiving it and riffing off of the original?
Absolutely.
And it's difference in how you go about it and what you think you're doing for the translation. And of course, everybody who reads the translation thinks that they're reading the original.
Yes, that is true. And the thing I feel that is super cool is when one studies a foreign language and when one gets some experience in translating things, you realize what losses you have or you're likely to have when you're reading another translation. So you're really having to be aware. And the more you can be aware of the biases of the translator or the cultural milieu of the translator and what their ambitions were, I think the more you'll get out of the experience.
The more knowledgeable the translator, the more nuanced the translation. It may not be easier to read or even more enjoyable, but it will come closer to the original author's meaning and his intended audience's understanding. This is a point that Beowulf's most recent translator, Tom Shippey, makes in his translator's preface. Shippey is one of the grand old men of Old English literary studies, and his translation reflects his lifetime of engagement in the field. Sometimes, however, deep knowledge of a field and language makes translating a text even more challenging. Consider how Shippey deals with the Old English word weird, from which we get our word weird. Quote, all too many translators, I fear, owe their knowledge of Old English to looking words up in the dictionary. This ignores cultural context and affects interpretations. Thus, a great deal of nonsense has been written for many years about words like weird. Look it up in the dictionary and it will probably tell you fate, creating an image of Anglo-Saxons as gloomy, passive, unrealistic, and frankly, not too bright. As an undergraduate, I was told repeatedly about the, quote, Anglo-Saxon tragic vision, end quote. Much of this is our mistake, not theirs. The word fate, for instance, derives from Latin fare, to speak, and it means what is spoken not by us, but by some supernatural power which we cannot affect. Weird, on the other hand, derives from the verb weathan, to become, to happen, and it means what happens, what has happened. The Old English word for historian is weird ritera, someone who writes down what's happened. When the poet of another Old English poem writes, weird bith full ared, the internet will tell you that this means fate is totally inexorable. But it doesn't. It means what happened is now fixed. End quote. So how does this actually affect a translation? Let's take a look at one line 455 in the poem, and it reads, Gath a weird flahioshel. The poet Seamus Heaney translates this as, fate goes ever as fate must. Shippey, on the other hand, translates it as, things will always go as they must. Perhaps a subtle difference, but a difference nonetheless. Or more briefly, what's done is done.
Right.
So when he sees weird in the poem, he doesn't necessarily translate it as fate. He translates it where he thinks the context would demand a different word or a different series of words to explain what the poet meant by weird at that moment in the poem.
Right. And I really like Maria Headley's discussion of the translation of the word. And, Richard, maybe you can correct my pronunciation. I say Aglaika, Aglaeaeca.
Aglaika.
And the sort of most important Old English translation rendition of Beowulf is this 19th century one by Kleber. And he defines Aglaik as hero when he's applying it to Beowulf, but he uses the same feminine version of the word to mean monster, demon, or fiend when talking about Grendel's mother and the dragon. And elsewhere in Old English, Agleka actually is used to talk about Bede, this actual man who was considered extremely holy. And so perhaps it means formidable.
Yeah, Berthworth of Ramsey, an early 11th century monk, characterized the Venerable Bede as an Agleka Lario. which I would like to believe meant an awesome teacher.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But when a translator decides to say that somebody's monstrous and horror fiend versus hero, that obviously is going to give the reader a really different impression.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
So, okay, let's talk about some of the translations of Beowulf and how different the translations can sound.
Right. I think that would be great.
What we'll do is take a passage.
Including the Old English, right? Because it just sounds like magic.
You do the Old English because...
All right, I'm going to apologize right now to everybody because I'm not I'm a historian, not a literature person, but I can... It's funner to hear than to not hear. So here we are. Yeah. Okay. So which... should we do with where the Danish Coast Guard is going to challenge Beowulf, who has just arrived? And this is around in the poem, and it's different in different versions, but it's in the Kleber version, it's around 237. So, Pace, all you lit people that might be here, but here we go. Okay, he's confronting Beowulf. What sinden je ser theo habendra, birnum werde, Theus bronte ceol over lagus streite, leiden quomen, hider over holmas, ich huile was, en de saita, I wear the heod Theolandina Lafra Naini Midshipper Seifan Nemayakte No her Kuthlichord Kuman Ongunnen Lind Habende Neye Leasnes Word Guth Framendra Yerwe Newison Maga Gemedu Nefreich Malran Yesea eorla ofer eorthan, phonius yeorsum, sechon searvum, nistat seldguma, winum yeworthaf nefrahim his wilte leoge, elnich eisin, duich eovershea, frumkin witten, ye firheonen leas, sharweas, onlandena, forthrefreren, nu je verbuend mere lithende, mine je hieras, an fealne je thot, ofos de celest, to je tane, Juanan eora kime season. You know, we can pretend that I'm a person from Old England from a different accent and one not taught.
No, actually, that sounded. But, you know, now that you've done that, I don't see any reason why we need a translation. It's so apparent.
Don't we all know what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think that we probably should emphasize, and by reading that you did emphasize it really, is that we call it Old English.
Right.
And when people think of Old English, probably most of our listeners would think Shakespeare.
I know.
No, that's modern English.
Right. Yeah.
And then maybe someone would say, oh, I know Canterbury Tales. Mm-hmm. No, that's Middle English, and that's late Middle English.
Right.
And when you get to Old English, you're not even really talking about the same language.
It's closer to German than it is.
It's closer to German. I've heard it argued that it's closest to modern day Dutch.
I've heard that too, yeah.
And it's a highly inflected language. Mm. It's got much more grammar than modern English has.
My goodness, yeah.
Yeah, and it has letters that don't appear in modern English.
Yeah.
So it's different, and it is a foreign language. So it really needs translation. You can work your way through the Canterbury Tales.
Right.
Yeah, especially if you have a glossary.
Right.
I don't think you can work your way through this without actually learning some of Old English.
No, it might as well be a battle like fighting Grendel's mother. Right?
So this is from Benjamin Thorpe, 1855.
Yeah.
Benjamin Thorpe did a transcription of the manuscript, and then he did what he called a word-for-word translation. Mm-hmm. So this is what it sounds like when you try a word-for-word translation. Mm. What are ye of arm-bearing men, with byrnies protected, who thus a surgy keel over the water street come leading hither o'er the seas? I for this, placed at the extremity seaward, have held, that on the Danes' land no enemies with a ship army might do injury, not here more openly to come have attempted shield-bearers, nor who the credence word of warriors ready knew not the observances of kinsmen. Never have I seen a greater earl on earth than is one of you, a warrior in arms. That is no man seldom honored in arms, unless his countenance belie him, his distinguished aspect. Now I must your origin know, ere you farther hence as false spies into the Danes' land further proceed. Now, ye far dwellers, seafarers, hear my simple thought. Haste is best to make known whence your coming is. Now, if you were to encounter this first,
you would not like Beowulf.
You would not read any of Beowulf. Yeah, you can make sense of what he's saying, but it's hard to follow it, and it's really ugly.
Super ugly. Yeah.
So you would go ahead and say, "Oh my God, I've been assigned to read that. What
right.
am I going to do?"
Yeah.
I hope that there's some sort of for this clip notes. I still do clip notes.
Not anymore. They probably just go to ChatGPT.
Okay, you see, that's what happens when you stop teaching. You don't get. Okay, so that is an 1855 attempt to do word for word translation, and it's a pretty good word for word translation.
Yeah,
he does the kennings,
right?
So he's not going to say a kenning like whale road,
right?
They would know immediately that meant see. A modern audience might have some difficulties.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what shall we contrast it with?
I mean, I think one way or the other, I'd love to do Maria Headley's, but also maybe Seamus Heaney.
Let's do Seamus Heaney, because that is, I think, the most popular.
Yeah. This is the one I assign to my students because I feel like I have 100% success rate. And I know if you want to get authentic, it's not as there's the Tolkien translation, and there's others that are more. But I love how he preserves the poetry, and I don't think it's that bad. I think it's great, actually. Of course, Seamus Heaney, right?
Seamus Heaney is a great poet.
Yeah.
If you're looking for just simply a literal telling of the story that's faithful to the text, then what I would recommend is the Donaldson translation of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
E. Talbot Donaldson did a prose translation, and prose is easier to read. The problem with it is it's accurate, it's really faithful, and it's kind of dull.
Yep. Yeah. The thing is, the people at the time would never have experienced this poem as dull. And so you don't want people, your students to have that either. And so there's something true about Seamus Heaney's translation in that way.
And what E. Talbot Donaldson's translation doesn't have is any music to it. Mm. There's no sense of word music in it.
Right.
So let's hear.
Okay, so this is Seamus Heaney as the Danish Coast Guard is challenging Beowulf and his fellow Hwæts. What kind of men are you who arrive rigged out for combat in coats of mail, sailing here over the sea lanes in your steep-hulled boat? I've been stationed as lookout on this coast for a long time. My job is to watch the waves for raiders, any danger to the Danish shore. Never before has a force under arms disembarked so openly, not bothering to ask if the sentries allowed them safe passage or the clan had consented. Nor have I seen a mightier man at arms on this earth than the one standing here. Unless I am mistaken, he is truly noble. This is no mere hanger-on in a hero's armor. So now, before you fare inland as interlopers, I have to be informed about who you are and where you hail from. Outsiders from across the water, I say it again. The sooner you tell where you come from and why, the better.
And it's a good translation. It stays close to the text.
Yes.
Just a little bit of the Donaldson translation. What are you bearers of armor dressed in mail coats, who thus have come bringing a tall ship over the sea road, over the water to this place? Lo, for a long time I've been guard on the coast, held watch by the sea, so that no foe with a force of ships might work hard on Dane's land. Never have shield bearers more openly undertaken to come ashore here, nor did you know for sure of a word of leave from our warriors, consent from my kinsmen. I have never seen a mightier warrior on earth than is one of you, a man in battle dress. This is no retainer, made to seem good by his weapons, unless his appearance belies him, his unequal form. It's very close to it. The Haney is more musical. It's more.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
But either one would give you the story, and the story itself will carry you through. I mean, it's a story about a hero and monsters. It's hard not to like it.
Exactly. And I also like the way that Haney's edition has the Old English. So even if you're a person that's not going to pick it up as a language, you can see there what the original is, and you can kind of try to match word for word and see how difficult it is, or where there might be some similar like alliteration or assonance that Haney's using.
It's a successful translation.
It's great, yeah.
I also like very much Hal D. Chickering Jr.'s verse translation of Beowulf, which is also in a dual language edition. It's obvious that I like it, as it's the translation that I quoted from in the first episode of this two-part series.
Yeah.
And now for something completely different. The most original and daring translation of Beowulf is by Maria Dahvana Headley.
Yeah, very recent. This is just published. Gosh, I should see, but if it's not this year, it was last year. It's the one, Beowulf, by Maria Headley, who also in 2018 did a rendition of a radical retelling of a story based on Beowulf called The Mere Wife. But this one actually, I guess it was 2020. Yeah, but here's her rendition, and she uses this kind of conceit that there's this, almost as though it's bro culture, super boasty, toxic masculinity, telling a story at a bar to boast. So the speaker isn't Beowulf, but has similar attributes as Beowulf, and she uses a lot of modern slang, and to me it's super catchy, and it is also not the original, so it's very different. Here we go, the same passage. How dare you come to Denmark costumed for war? Chainmail and swords? There's a dress code. You're denied. I'm the Dane's doorman. This is my lord's door. Who are you that you dare steer your ship for our shore? I'm the watcher of these waters, have been for years, and it's my duty to scan the sea for shield-bearing dangers to Danes. I've never seen any force come so confidently over swells, certain of welcome. No welcome won. Did you send word? No. Were you invited? No. You're not on the guest list. And also, who's the giant? What weapons does he hold? Oh, hell no. He's no small-time hall soldier, but noble. Look at his armor. I'm done here. Spies, state your secrets or be denounced. Who are you? What's your business? Where'd you come from? I'll ask one more time. You're not coming past this cliff. Answer now or bounce. You men, who, where, why?
Yeah.
Isn't that fun? It's fun.
One of the things that really announces how different this translation is, the first word in the manuscript is literally what? Hwæt. That's the first word. It's traditionally translated with something like lo. Mm-hmm. Although probably the best way of translating it, the functional way of translating it is, hey guys, listen, Hark, we've got something to say. The way that Headley translates it, the way that Headley starts off with is bro. Yeah.
Right. And where she's going with it. Yeah, it is
a bro story.
Totally.
And it's a bro story not for bros. It's a bro story about, in some ways, toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she's emphasizing the negative aspects of Hrothgar as this ruler who hasn't really done anything for his people in 12 years while they get picked out. And then Beowulf as being this overly boastful, more on the Roland side of, putting his people at risk with his, kind of behavior, which is, a really different take, obviously. And then a much more empathic version of Grendel's mother, who's yes. Instead of being this monster, she's very, very powerful. I mean, obviously still the enemy, but much more sympathetic.
For those interested, the Headley translation is available online, and it is a fun read. But I think to really appreciate it and appreciate what she's doing with it, you have to first read one of the more literal translations of Beowulf.
Mm-hmm.
With Headley, what you're already doing is segueing to the adaptations of Beowulf, which is where we should go now.
Right.
I'm going to begin with a work that I can't prove is an adaptation of Beowulf, but whose plot so closely follows the first half of the poem that it seems unlikely to be a coincidence. That work is Rikki Tikki Tavi, a short story included in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book.
Yeah. Yes.
For those who haven't read it, Rikki Tikki Tavi is a story about a heroic mongoose who defends an English family in India against two cobras. The narrative structure of the tale follows the first half of Beowulf. Whereas Beowulf arrives by sea, Rikki Tikki Tavi is washed up by a flood onto the garden path of the English family's bungalow. Beowulf kills Grendel when the monster breaks into Hwæt. Rikki kills the male cobra Naga, who is lying in wait for the Englishman in his bathroom. Grendel's mother attacks Hwæt to avenge her son's death. The female cobra, Nagi-Ina, threatens the English family on their veranda to avenge her mate. Beowulf pursues Grendel's mother to her lair under the mere. Rikki Tikki pursues Nagi-Ina underground into her hole. Beowulf's companions stand vigil, and when they see blood in the water of the mere mourn his death. The tailor bird and his wife stand vigil, and when the grass by the mouth of the hole stops waving, sing a death song for the valiant Rikki Tikki. Beowulf emerges victorious and is honored and given gifts by Hrothgar. Rikki Tikki returns to the grateful family, who praise him for saving them twice, and is given all that he can eat. Hwæt is free from the threat of monsters. The bungalow is free from the threat of snakes. Kipling presents Rikki Tikki in heroic terms. During his fight with Nag, the cobra attempts to shake loose the mongoose, who's biting his neck. Rikki Tikki is knocked against the wall. But as Kipling wrote, quote, "As he held, he closed his jaws tighter and tighter, for he made sure he would be banged to death, and for the honor of his family, he preferred to be found with his teeth locked." This is such a great, heroic Anglo-Saxon sentiment.
Yeah.
Kipling even has an animal version of an Anglo-Saxon shop, an Anglo-Saxon minstrel, to sing the praises of the victorious mongoose. Darzy, the tailor bird, sings, "Nag is dead, is dead, is dead. The valiant Rikki Tikki caught him by the head and held fast. He will never eat my babies again. Let us sing about the great, the red-eyed Rikki Tikki." Many years ago, I toyed with writing an article comparing Rikki Tikki Tavi with Beowulf. That idea was put to rest in 2001 when Bard Kosman beat me to it. Based on my admittedly limited research, I couldn't prove that Kipling had read Beowulf. Neither could Kosman. It's not mentioned in any of Kipling's letters, but like me, Kosman was struck by the correspondences between the poem and the story. It would be surprising if Kipling didn't know Beowulf. When The Jungle Book was published in 1896, there were already 9 English translations of Beowulf in circulation. Kipling, we know, loved the history and legends of early England. His Puck of Pook's Hill, published in 1906, is a historical fantasy in which 2 children are told stories by an assortment of Roman and medieval people magically transported to the present day by the elf Puck.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Although there is no hard evidence that Kipling read Beowulf, I would be willing to bet that he did, and that Rikki Tikki Tavi was an animal tale homage to that epic poem.
Sure, yes.
And so, but that is a animal fable version of Beowulf.
Right.
The analog to that, I think, is a wonderful graphic novel called Beowulf, B-E-A.
The recent, yeah.
And it's recent. It was done in 2023.
Right.
It's recent. The writer is Zach Weinersmith, and the artist is Boulet, a French cartoonist.
Mm-hmm.
And this one it's a kid's story. It's about a gang of heroic 5-year-old kids, introduced as, quote, the unbowed bully crushers, the bedtime breakers, fighters of fun killers, fated for fame, who build a treehouse. This treehouse is to be, quote, a safe house for kids, strong against foes, a high wall, built hard, binding oak and aspen, bridging tree and time, end quote. The enemy is a fun-killing, literally fun-killing, adult named Mr. Grendel, the fun grinder, grim-faced joy gobbler. Anything he touches grows old. Kitties become cats, piglets pigs, calves become cows, elastic waistbands withered from undies like time-worn parchment, and children he touches suddenly become teenaged, tired-eyed, ever-texting, or worse, middle-aged, aching, anxious, angry at the internet.
Fantastic.
The treehouse overhangs Grendel's yard. Pained by the butt jokes and belching laughter, the vast volume video games of no educational value whatsoever, and especially by the joy and silliness of birthday parties, he enters the treehouse at night and he begeezers the kids. The king of the kids, Roger, can do nothing to stop Grendel, and the treehouse becomes deserted and lifeless. Finally, a hero arrives from Heidi's hold upriver to battle the Hall Beast. Her name is Beowulf. Okay, remember the various translations we read about the coming of Beowulf and his troop to the shores of the Danes? Well, here is Wienersmith's version of it. Wendy, Roger's watch girl, spies Beowulf and a troop coming on the river in their inner tubes. She challenges them, quote, "What kids are you who come to Roger's kingdom sailing the sliding sea, slinging sword and dart? I see from your fantasy-style accessories you seek to make war. How dare you dock here, dressed for the battle dance? You gave no warning of your coming, not by firework nor kazoo blast. Yet never have I met such might, so many martial masters, helmets of undies, no hand-me-downs thieves, fresh from the undie pack. Your leader sparkles with power, and also with sparkles."
Super charming.
As you can tell, I love Beowulf. It's a great children's book, and it's fun, but it also gives you a feeling of what it was like to read Beowulf. Because of the alliteration. It just works.
Yeah.
I was lent a copy by one of my tennis partners, Tony Perotti. Hi, Tony. And was so impressed by it that I bought a copy for my 13-year-old grandson and 11-year-old granddaughter. I'm also giving them a copy of Beowulf to read first.
It's just charming. It's great because you don't have to really know the original poem to enjoy like this children's version, nor Maria Headley's version. You can just enjoy them on their own for what they are now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned Maria Headley's translation, let's talk about her adaptation of Beowulf, a much darker, much more adult, and much grimmer adaptation called The Mere Wife, which is, in its own way, is equally radical.
Oh, yeah. I would say more radical because it's really a different story using the story of... It is. It's depressing. It does not end well.
It is depressing.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell basically the premise of it and what the basic story is?
Sure, yeah. So in The Mere Wife, Headley
and that's
reimagined...
M-E-R-E.
Right, like merely a wife, but also mere is in a lake, getting at the monster Grendel's mom's abode.
It's a double entendre, a clean double entendre, and yeah, there are clean double entendres, and a really clever one. What Headley has done is taken a term from the poem itself. In line 1519, Grendel's mother is called a mere wife, literally a sea woman. The primary meaning of Old English wife, W-I-F, is not wife, but woman.
Yeah, yes.
The phrase is descriptive. Think mermaid. But I believe it's also meant to contrast Grendel's mother with Waltheow. Grendel's mother is a swamp woman who, in contrast to Queen Waltheow, lives in the wild. She does not make bread. She does not carry a mead cup serving her lord's thanes one after another according to rank, and she does not weave peace. And that's also true of the mere wife of the novel, Dana.
Yeah. So in The Mere Wife, there's this woman that's scarred by PTSD from the Iraqi wars. She's American, and she's taking up shelter in a mountain with her son, who is the the Grendel character, and his name is Dylan, her name is Dana, and it's overlooking this really elite, closed-gated community. That's Hwæt. And then her kind of polar opposite mirrored self is a woman that's absolutely subject to the buildings of patriarchy. So this is Willa, and that she has, on the one hand, she's monstrous in her own way, but she also is like the inversion of Wealtheo, the good queen in the actual poem. And so here she is. It's really Margaret Atwood meets Beowulf in many ways. There's the men in the poem are really peripheral. The women are up in front, and the enemy is patriarchy, which isn't just destructive to the women characters, it's destructive to everybody, and including the children. And so there's two children. Both of the main characters have boys that become friends in a kind of Romeo and Juliet, they're not supposed to be friends sort of way. And the kind of horrible things that follow in tragedy are because of the expectations that Willow's under and how she buys into the patriarchy, as well as this kind of leitmotif story of race and class. So class is to the forefront with Dana and Willa coming from very different backgrounds.
There's an implication, though the novel never comes out and says it directly, that Gren, Dana's son, is perhaps perceived as black. He is the offspring of Dana and her Islamist captor. So the novel is not only about class, it's also about race.
Much like Shakespeare's character in The Tempest.
Yeah, you never find out. There's always a sense that there's something wrong with Gren.
Gren. Yeah.
That if people see them, they mistake him for a monster rather than a little boy.
Yeah. But Dana keeps saying stuff like, to me, I just see a person that looks like me.
Yes.
Yeah. And he's not monstrous to Willa's son.
Oh, no. He's Willa's son's best friend. And basically, it's a love story about two little boys.
Yeah. And it's also sad. The really terrible enemies, like Margaret Atwood's most villainous characters tend to be, are the women of Hwæt that form a kind of Greek chorus.
The mothers.
And they but they're horrible to everybody, and they're like, I love how Headley talks about them. They're like, they do yoga and they do kickboxing, and they get super in shape for a wilderness. Like, for what kind of combat are these well-heeled women going to experience?
And constantly judging every other woman.
Yes. And yes, absolutely. And who you marry and how you spin your narrative of marriage and the status you get by that is the most important thing.
The only sympathetic characters in the book. Yes, the children. And also Dana, the midwife. She's a combat veteran suffering from severe PTSD.
Also kind of psychotic.
And she is psychotic.
Yeah.
And because of that, she's an unreliable narrator. But she has only one real goal in life, and that's to protect her son.
Right.
She's convinced will be killed by the society if they know about him.
Right.
And she sacrifices everything for that.
Yeah.
The son, Gren.
Yeah, and I kept on calling him Dylan, and that's wrong. Dylan is the other Willa's son.
Dylan is the other little kid. The little kids are sympathetic.
Yeah.
And that's really about it.
Mm.
Willa is
weak. She's a wannabe actress that never made it.
And
so she throws in her
reluctant mother.
Oh, yeah. Mommy dearest.
There are roles she feels that she should be playing.
Right.
And she doesn't really love her husband. He was just simply the proper man to marry.
Mm-hmm. Roger. Hrothgar.
And Roger, Hrothgar.
Right.
And when she ends up with the hero is not really a hero.
He's a sad sack. Beowulf is just this, he's a cop who is overly interested in his body physique. Ben Wolf, exactly.
A wannabe hero.
Who just doesn't really do much in the story. He's very peripheral.
He's very peripheral, and he's weak because it's a story about women.
Yeah.
And it's about have-nots and haves.
Yeah.
And I think it's also about status, about wealth.
Inclusion. And what those who are in the specialer groups and those who are not.
And there are no winners in this.
No.
It is bleak.
Yeah, but good. It lingered when I read it. I mean, we were talking before about how if I'm going to read something sad, it's got to have a payoff. I feel like this one was worth it.
Okay, on to Neil Gaiman. Gaiman is one of my very favorite fantasy writers.
Mine too, yes.
I love virtually everything he's written, from the graphic novel The Sandman to Coraline to Good Omens, co-written with Terry Pratchett, to American Gods. Like I said, virtually everything. Gaiman was a voracious reader as a kid, and one of the things he read that stuck with him was the poem Beowulf. We'll talk a little later about his script for the Robert Zemeckis film adaptation of Beowulf, but first I'd like to talk about two other of his works that draw upon Beowulf, the poem Beowulf, and the short story Monarch of the Glen, set in the world of American Gods. As you can tell from its title, Beowulf is a good-humored parody. Gaiman explains in the introduction to his collection Smoke and Mirrors that when he told people that he had co-authored the Beowulf screenplay, a surprising number thought that he had written an episode of the then super-popular TV show Baywatch. It struck him as funny, so he wrote this poem. And it's literally called Beowulf, B-A-Y, Wolf. And believe it or not, it is a really pretty faithful retelling of the Beowulf story, set in modern times on a beach with a discotheque taking the place of Heorot,
right,
and a monster living out on an oil derrick with his mom, whose ears are hurt by the blasting of the music.
The music, yeah.
And our sort of mafia-type owner of the discotheque, a nightclub, whose name is Garroth, hires Beowulf, who is a werewolf.
Right. Therein lies the discrepancy, because the Beowulf character is not.
Whose name is Lawrence Talbot, which is taken directly from the 1941 Universal movie, The Wolfman.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And he's a fixer. He's an adjuster. He appears in a couple of other stories of Gaiman. He's a good werewolf, except when he's a werewolf, in which case he may actually eat
you. Yeah.
He can't help it.
As werewolves do.
And he goes ahead and he fights and kills the monster and then goes to fight the monster's mom, but it turns out not to fight her. Turns out instead, as a sort of spoiler for his version of Beowulf in the movie,
right.
They end up instead, what would be a polite way of saying canoodling?
Canoodling, okay. Yeah, they canoodle.
They canoodle. But he declares her dead and everybody's happy. That's the first one. The second one is called Monarch of the Glen. Yeah. A lot more serious.
I like that one.
It's from the American Gods universe. And it takes place after the novel has ended. And our hero, Shadow, is basically wandering. He's going through Europe before he goes back to the U.S. As the novella begins, Shadow is staying at an inn in a remote and desolate part of the Scottish Highlands. At the inn, he meets a seemingly friendly local, seemingly is important here, Dr. Gaskell, who comments on Shadow's size and jokes that he must be a bit of a monster, isn't he? Dining at the inn is a large, homely man with large ears and his mother. The man is complaining that the noise coming from the inn hurts his sensitive ears. Shadow also meets the maid Jenny, who turns out to be a supernatural creature, a holder, but we can find that out much later. Because Shadow looks so large and formidable and really tough-looking, although Shadow is one of the more passive characters, I think, in literature, but everybody thinks he's really tough and all that. Dr. Gaskell thinks that he would be perfect for the security detail for an exclusive private party to be held at a nearby estate. Gaskell assures him that it is easy money and introduces him to a man named Smith. Smith is the right-hand man of Mr. Alice, the super wealthy and shadowy host of the party. Gaiman readers will recognize them from an earlier story where we are introduced to Smith as a smart, tough sociopath.
Right.
Shadow accepts the job, and that's the setup for the story.
Right.
And what Shadow doesn't know is that he's being hired because there is an annual traditional replay of the Grendel Beowulf story.
Right. Kind of like the Wicker Man.
In which the hero will fight the monster. The difference, however, is that the hero gets sacrificed as well.
Right. And Shadow kind of knows what's up for him. There's a kind of looming situation of dread. But I think one of the things that this version does is really follows in a tradition that happens in the late 20th century through now, where the monsters is seen as more sympathetic.
Yes. And the normal people are seen as more monstrous.
And so that's the case in some literature, other like the John Gardner's book, and in the short story of by Neil Gaiman, the Shadow refuses to fight Grendel because he knows the fight's unfair, and because of this action, which is the inverse of the actual Beowulf, is very bellicose.
And the people around him are throwing things at him and pelting him because he won't fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But his willingness to, even though it's costing him to stay his hand, actually enables him to live.
And he is saved by Jetty, who reveals herself to be a Hulder, a Scandinavian forest creature. The Grendel figure and his mom appear as sort of working class Scots.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The mom has a handbag.
Right.
But she is scary.
Super scary.
Super scary.
Yeah.
She scares the security chief.
Right. And it's she that actually provides safety for Beowulf because Beowulf's not going to kill her son.
Yes.
And so that action's the heroic action.
It breaks the tradition. Breaks the tradition. It's a wonderful story, and it's a wonderful take on the Beowulf story.
John Gardner's book?
Yeah, it's John Gardner's book.
Might not want to spend, I don't know how much time we want to spend on it, but...
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I just reread it.
Yeah, I did too, over the summer.
And first of all, the basic thing is, it's from Grendel's point of view.
Because it's called Grendel.
And there's a silly animated version, Grendel.
Yeah.
I don't like it, although it gets praised. I don't know why it gets praised. I wasn't quite sure whether John Gardner meant us to take this seriously or not, because you have long speeches which are basically postmodernist philosophy speeches put in the mouth of a dragon.
Yeah. He had wanted, I think, to cover Sartre's philosophy and aimed his book to be on different elements on being and nothingness by Sartre. And so it's existentialism. Yeah, but not in a good way. I thought it was for me, the Grendel character was really annoying. The dragon character was really annoying.
Oh, the dragon character.
He constantly talked about everything is meaningless. His mom can't even speak a word that actually makes sense. There's no meaning.
Which is the reason why he is so lonely.
Yeah.
And he feels himself monstrous because he's cut off from everything except the only thing that he likes and admires is the poetry.
Yeah,
the songs of the shaper, of the harpist. But this, I think, is the essence of Grendel worldview.
Yeah.
I understood that the world was nothing, a mechanical chaos of casual, brute enmity on which we stupidly impose our hopes and fears. I understood that finally and absolutely I alone exist. All the rest I saw is merely what pushes me or what I push against blindly as all that is not myself pushes back. I create the whole universe blink by blink, an ugly God pitifully dying in a tree.
It's so whiny. It's so Catcher in the Rye. I mean, I know if you like Catcher in the Rye, that's great, but just so solipsistic and I like existentialist philosophy, but
it reminded me a little bit of The Stranger, because whether he kills something or not is just simply, it doesn't matter.
Nothing matters.
Nothing really matters. His actions don't matter. Nothing is going to, and so much of it is by chance, and even his death at the end, as he keeps on saying, it's by accident.
Meaningless.
It's by accident. It's not because you, the hero, killed me.
it's because it's an accident.
Yeah.
And I like existentialist philosophy. I think that there's a lot to it. There's many different expressions, but I know that Sartre also had messages of saying, well, it's up to you to create meaning of your life and live an authentic life. And that kind of more positive aspect of existential philosophy really doesn't come through in that novel.
No, and he wants to play with the difference between the existentialist worldview and the worldview of the artist. The artist creates meaning. The artist reshapes the world into something that is meaningful and that it's false.
Right, and emphasis on the false instead of it's like this luring lie.
And Grendel is attracted to it. He wants to believe it.
Right.
It does have a wonderful portrayal of Unferth as a would-be hero.
Right.
And Grendel doesn't kill him because Grendel prefers to humiliate him.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, but it's not fun.
It made waves when it was published in 1971, but I think it's just because of how different it was. It's always fun when an author takes something that's a kind of mythic story from throughout the ages and radically reimagines it. And so that's what he did.
I much prefer John Gardner's In the Suicide Mountains. So if you're going to read one of John Gardner, I would suggest In the Suicide Mountains.
Cool.
Okay, let's turn to movies.
Absolutely.
In earlier episodes, I've divided movies into the good, the bad, and the ugly. And because as a teacher I always like plus-minus grading, I also have the not-so-bad category. There are representatives of each for film adaptations of Beowulf. Let's start with a film that is downright ugly in virtually every cinematic aspect. A dystopian science fiction version of the poem, the 1999 Beowulf, starring a really uncomfortably looking Christopher Lambert.
In the future lies a fortress at the edge of darkness. The enemy is at the gate, but the real terror is within. A man more than mortal, born half of heaven and half of hell, is their only salvation.
No sane man would come here to face this thing. And not like other men.
That you have to prove.
Christopher Lambert is Beowulf.
I know that you haven't seen this movie, Chrissy. It's really, really bad. It was shot on a shoestring budget with a bad script and worst acting. The movie is set in a Mad Max retro medieval future. The sets and costuming are medieval steampunk. Hrothgar's nameless and literally faceless disposable soldiers wear vaguely medieval plate armor with helmets that seem to lack an eye slit. The movie has a couple of interesting ideas that have nothing to do with the poem. Beowulf's ability to fight and kill monsters is explained by his parentage as the mixed offspring of a mortal woman and a demon. He contains his internal evil by turning it outward against monsters. The other idea is one that we'll see again in the Robert Zemeckis big-budget Beowulf. Grendel in this film is the son of Hrothgar and a beautiful succubus-type demon. After Beowulf kills Grendel, his mother tries to seduce the hero, and failing that, transforms herself into a giant spider-like monster. The special effects are nothing special. Not surprising that the movie budget was a little over $3 million. But the action scenes are even worse, with Beowulf on horseback armed with miniature wrist crossbows, fights against dozens of soldiers in order to rescue a girl who's about to be chopped in half. Fortunately for Beowulf, the soldiers either mill about shaking their weapons and shouting at him, or they attack him one at a time. When Beowulf dismounts to release the girl from her bonds, we discover his go-to fighting move, a backflip. In the climatic fight with Grendel, Beowulf does a series of backflips for no apparent purpose. I'm not sure if this is a redeeming quality for the movie, but it did provoke a really funny movie review by Carlo Cavagna of the online movie website About Film. Cavagna wrote, quote, "Beowulf is the earliest surviving epic poem written in English, yet the English in which it is composed is so archaic It cannot be understood without a translation. In an effort to give you, dear reader, an insight into the source material from which screenwriters Mark Leahy and David Chappie reverently drew, we offer the following translation of certain key passages. Chrissy will read the Old English in her inimitable style, and I will give Cavagna's translations.
Swatha, drickuman, dreamum lifton adliche, os fat on ongan, frena fremen feon on hela, was se grima geest, Grendel hatten mar, mear stappa, se moras heod, fenon fosten, fiferkine veerd.
On the moors the Lord's men lived. All was relatively okay until one began to execute atrocities. A fiend from hell, an infamous stalker, fed he upon the stupid who investigate strange noises all alone. This ghastly demon was known as Grendel.
Nicht longne first dean bidan, grimre, gusse, gifu Grendels derst, mas leore bern, exeoes, October 1997, Playboy Planet of the month, Huba, hoof, hoof.
Meanwhile, in the darkest hours of night, Hrothgar dreamt of Grendel's beguiling mother, former handmaiden to the great Lord Hefner. Great big synthetic breasts had she, and proudly did she reveal them, verily, before turning into a mean, ugly monster that is. Well, that should give you a flavor of Cavagna's review. You should read the whole review. It actually gives you a good sense of the movie. Now, for my movie review, Graham Baker's post-apocalyptic version of Beowulf is a very, very bad movie that I can recommend only to those who like very, very bad movies. I laughed out loud several times, so there is a reason to see it. It's not Monty Python, but with a little more effort, it could have been. It would make a good double feature with Plan 9 from Outer Space. Now for something completely different. In the category of not so bad, I might even have said good, except I suspect that Chrissy is already looking at me askance, is a 27-minute-long cartoon, Animated Epics, Beowulf. This 1998 joint Russian-Welsh production, yes, Russian-Welsh production, was directed by Yuri Kulikov. It's without doubt the most faithful movie treatment of the poem, and unlike many Beowulf adaptations, covers the entire poem, all of it in 27 minutes.
Yeah.
It has a good voice cast. Derek Jacobi is a narrator. Joseph Fiennes plays Beowulf. Timothy West as Hrothgar. Very simple animation, I thought.
Totally boring.
Yeah, we talked about this. I liked it better than you did, and I didn't find it completely boring, but I have to grant it's not the most exciting take on the poem. If you were assigned Beowulf for a class, you can go see this and you'll get the story from Beowulf.
Right, if you just want the story.
If you just want the story. The 2005 Canadian-Icelandic production, Beowulf and Grendel, is more interesting, though less faithful. The movie was directed by Sturla Gunnarsson and starred Gerard Butler as Beowulf, Stellan Skarsgård as Hrothgar, Ingvar Eggert Sigurdsson as Grendel, and a woefully miscast Sarah Pauli as a witch woman named Selma. And if you're wondering, there is no Selma in the Old English poem. Filmed in Iceland, the movie's scenery is breathtaking. Chrissy, I know that you didn't have a chance to see the movie, but I think you might like it. So let me tell you about it. In outline, it follows the Grendel episode of the poem with a prologue that announces that this is a very different take on the story. The movie opens with a large, hairy man fleeing with a child in his arms. He finds himself at the edge of a cliff, puts his son down, and turns to face his pursuers. The man in charge, we will learn, is Hrothgar, king of the Danes. The Danes shoot the man with arrows. Dying, the man staggers over the cliff. Hrothgar sees the young boy, who oddly already has a fluffy little beard, hanging over the cliff, but spares him and says nothing to the others. They ride away, and the boy climbs down to the beach. He cuts off his father's head and takes it back to the cave in which they live. There he makes it the center of a shrine. Okay, a couple of decades later, Hrothgar, king of the Danes, celebrates his wealth and his power by having a great mead hall built. But after a night of feasting, Hrothgar discovers 20 of his warriors killed and their heads taken. As in the poem, the hall becomes deserted and Hrothgar falls into a deep depression. News reaches Geatland. They do pronounce it as Geats, not Yets. And Beowulf, who already has earned the reputation of a hero, asks King Hygelac permission to aid Hrothgar. Beowulf, as a boy, had been in Hrothgar's court when Hrothgar had given Beowulf's father refuge. Now he's coming to repay that debt, but also he's doing this because he's a hero. As in the poem, Beowulf and his 13 companions sail to the land of the Danes, are challenged by Hrothgar's coast warden, and taken to Hrothgar. Hrothgar warmly embraces Beowulf, whom he hasn't seen since Beowulf was 8 years old, and again, as in the poem, Beowulf is challenged by Unferth in a brief fighting match. But now the movie departs significantly from the poem. The Geats lie awake awaiting Grendel, but when Grendel discovers that they are not Danes, he retreats without killing any of them. Selma, the beautiful outcast witch woman who can foretell deaths, explains to Beowulf that Grendel didn't attack them because the Geats had done him no wrong, which leads Beowulf to wonder what wrong Grendel is avenging. What the viewer knows, that Beowulf doesn't, is that Hrothgar's men killed Grendel's father. Now grown to manhood, the boy is intent on avenging the death of his father. Beowulf is frustrated by Grendel's unwillingness to fight him. He is convinced by Selma that the monster is motivated by a real grievance, which no one seems willing to share with him. He also learns that Grendel can speak a language that Selma understands, and that Grendel occasionally visits her in her hut, but does her no harm. Beowulf is conflicted, but as a hero, he is bound by his word and his loyalty to Hrothgar to free the Danes of the scourge. The Geats are taken to Grendel's cave by a villager. Grendel is not there, but they discover his lair and the mummified head of his father. One of the Geats smashes the head to pieces. This is the motivation Grendel needs to attack the Geats in the hall. That night, he breaks into the hall and kills the man who desecrated the shrine, but is grabbed by Beowulf. In trying to escape, Grendel's arm is caught in a trap, leaving him hanging helplessly. Grendel frees himself by cutting off his arm. He falls to the ground and staggers away to die next to the mare. A webbed hand reaches from the water, grabs the corpse, and takes it into the sea. Beowulf point blank asks Hrothgar who Grendel was and what grievance he had against the Danes. Hrothgar finally explains about how he had ordered Grendel's father killed for stealing a fish. That night, the Danes party hardy in the hall. They nail Grendel's arm to a post. Meanwhile, Beowulf goes to visit Selma in her hut. She tells him that Grendel had years before discovered her hut and raped her almost without thought. She bore him a son. Grendel never assaulted her again. Instead, he protected her. She follows this confession by having sex with Beowulf for reasons that are still unclear to me. As in the poem, Grendel's death is avenged by his mother. Twice earlier in the film, we've seen a webbed hand emerge from the mare to grab at a Geat in the boat. This hand, we now learn, belongs to Grendel's mother. She's a supernatural creature, much like the poem's Merryleaf. As in the poem, she breaks into the hall to retrieve the arm of her son and avenges his death by killing a bunch of people. Beowulf pursues her. As in the poem, he dives into the water to access her lair, which lies on the other side of an outcropping. He grapples with her, but she proves to be stronger. She gets on top of him and chokes him until he manages to snatch a sword from what looks like a treasure hoard and kills her. Hiding in a corner is a young boy, the son of Grendel and Selma. Beowulf leaves him alive. He tells Selma that she will need to protect him, and then he sails back. I found the movie to be an interesting take on the poem. Grendel has as much claim, if not more, to be its hero. He is avenging the death of his father. He won't fight or kill anyone who has not first harmed him. He is brutish, but not monstrous. We really don't know whether he is human or supernatural until the end when we see his mother. The movie plays with this rationalizing of the poem. Beowulf is introduced at the end of his swimming match with Breca, but in this case it's not a swimming match. Breca and he had gone out hunting walruses when their boat capsized and he had to swim to shore. Beowulf is a conflicted hero. He's motivated by honor and reputation. Once he has pledged to kill Grendel, he can't back away. He defeats Grendel not because he's stronger, but because Grendel falls into a trap. Hrothgar is also conflicted. He alone knows why Grendel has been ravaging his people. The movie also introduces religion. An Irish monk is converting Hrothgar's terrified people by promising them heaven. His pitch to Hrothgar is really medieval. Hrothgar should convert because the Christian God is more powerful than Hrothgar's gods. The proof he offers is that Clovis, king of the Franks, converted, and after he converted, he gained the largest empire of his time. QED, the Christian God is the most powerful God. Beowulf and Grendel is, as I said, an interesting take on the poem, although its values have more to do with 2005 than with the early Middle Ages. Nonetheless, I would give it a higher rating than the meh 48% that it has on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, if you're talking about major Beowulf things, I think, and the ones that are most interesting are two of them.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is called The 13th Warrior, which wouldn't sound like it has anything to do with Beowulf.
Right.
But it really does, because it's based upon Michael Crichton's novel, The Eaters of the Dead, made in 1999. Novel was 1976. Crichton combined Beowulf with a historical source, a report to the Abbasid Caliphate written by an early 10th century Arab diplomat and fakir, an expert in Islamic jurisprudence, a man by the name of Ahmed ibn Fadlan. The most famous section of Ibn Fadlan's report is an account of his visit to a Volga Rus settlement.
And the Rus are Eastern Vikings.
It's one of the most valuable accounts we have of the culture of Viking Age Scandinavians.
Right.
Has a wonderful depiction of a funeral of a chieftain and a ritual sacrifice of a slave woman.
I think we talked about it when we did the podcast on Vikings.
Yes. Yeah, and we actually mentioned the movie The 13th Warrior and played a clip from it about that ritual sacrifice of the slave woman in the funeral. So Michael Crichton took this historical source and he took another historical source, the Beowulf poem, and he put them together. Crichton's novel, Eater of the Dead, like Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, is a playful literary fraud. It represents itself as a found medieval manuscript that completes the fragmentary surviving manuscripts of Ibn Fadlan's report. The new material in it is the basis for the Beowulf story. Not an obvious connection whatsoever, but Crichton actually makes it work.
Yeah.
Ibn Fadlan, in the novel and the movie, ends up as part of a crew that's being sent to support a neighboring Scandinavian chieftain who is dealing with the attack of a monster.
The Wendel. Sounds like Grendel. Yeah. They're like, They're really cannibals. They're not, they're not
They're
supernatural.
troglodytes, literally.
Yeah.
They live in caves, although troglodytes who ride horses, which I never...
Yeah, they're kind of more human than alien, alien human versus wholly fantastic.
Yeah. They remind me of the cannibalistic Indian cave dwellers in the 2015 Western horror movie Bone Tomahawk, a film that you probably haven't seen.
Yeah. And there's a king's son named Bullywif who... Yes,
who is our Beowulf character.
Right. And that's how the two stories are married to each other, the real historical account of Ibn Fadlan and then this kind of component of Beowulf that is added into the Michael Crichton story.
Despite its paltry 33% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on 88 critics' reviews, I think the movie is worth seeing. It has flaws, its pacing is uneven, and the fearsome enemy turns out to be not nearly as fearsome as one might expect. The Beowulf character dispatches both the mother of the Wendels and the warlord of the tribe too quickly, given the build-up to the scenes. But for historians and history teachers, it has some good points.
Right.
The Wendels are represented literally as berserkers. They wear bearskins and have head coverings made from the heads of bears. The Vikings only gradually realize that they are human enemies. As John and Andy, the really knowledgeable co-hosts of the wonderful podcast, The Saga Thing, point out, the movie's portrayal of a Viking duel, a holmgang, is straight out of the sagas, and Beowulf's death captures the heroic stoicism of the sagas. But what I especially liked in the movie is its depiction of the meeting of cultures. The movie's Ibn Fadlan, played by Antonio Banderas, is a cultured intellectual Arab who is fascinated and appalled by the filth and violence of the Rus. In this, the movie and novel are faithful to the historical source material. Over the course of the film, Ibn Fadlan and his Viking companions learn to respect one another, which goes well beyond the historical source material. But to gain mutual understanding and respect, they must overcome the barrier of language. And this movie does something that I have rarely seen in historical movies. It deals explicitly with the problem of language. Ibn Fadlan does not speak Norse, and the Norse don't speak any of the languages with which Ibn Fadlan is conversant. When Ibn Fadlan finds himself aboard a Viking ship as the 13th Warrior, at first he can't understand a word his shipmates say. We hear them speaking Old Norse, but gradually an English word pops in. Ibn Fadlan is the moviegoer's POV, and Arabic is rendered as English in the movie.
It's cool.
Until at the end, it's all in English. Ibn Fadlan has mastered Norse.
Yeah, it is cool.
I also like Beowulf's fascination with Ibn Fadlan's literacy and his ability to be able to preserve speech and preserve the fame of heroes in writing. Now, the bottom line is I like The 13th Warrior both as a movie and as a medieval movie. But I'm not sure how much it really has to do with the poem Beowulf. Okay, we now come to our last film, the most ambitious and critically successful movie adaptation, the 2007 Beowulf, directed by Robert Zemeckis and written by Neil Gaiman and Roger Avery. The voice actors include Ray Winston as Beowulf, Anthony Hopkins as Hrothgar, Robin Wright Penn as Wealhtheow, John Malkovich as Unferth, Crispin Glover as Grendel, and Angelina Jolie as Grendel's mother. Zemeckis chose motion capture animation.
It was cutting edge back in 2007.
Yeah, it looks kind of jerky now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, jerky in terms of movements now.
Right, right.
So what do you think of this take on the Beowulf story?
Yeah, and I think it's genius. I'm willing to say fight me for this. I know many people didn't like it because of the changes that were made to the story, and Angelina Jolie is this really super sexy succubus kind of.
I never noticed that.
Hey, I'm a straight woman, and I
have to see it again.
But yeah. I think it's genius. I feel like it was such a creative way of respinning the story.
Grendel and the dragon become the wages of the sin of pride.
Exactly. So the narrative of the movie really follows the poem fairly faithfully until the Beowulf character goes into the mare, the lake, to yes. fight Grendel's mother. And there we learn that Grendel's mother had actually slept with Hrothgar, and their child was Grendel. Yeah. And so Beowulf is, instead of killing Grendel's mother, he has sex with her.
What do you know of me, demon?
I know that underneath your glamour, you're as much a monster as my son, Grendel. A man like you could own the greatest tale ever sung. Your story would live on when everything now alive is dust. Stay with me. Love me. Love me, and I shall weave you riches beyond imagination. I shall make you the greatest king that ever lived.
And the offspring is?
The dragon.
The
dragon at the end.
Yes.
And from there, the story really diverts. all kinds of different things happen with Hwæt. Beowulf ends up marrying her. Hrothgar commits suicide because he's like happy to be finally released from this curse, but he knows what Beowulf has done because he was the one that originally had sex with the monster. And so Beowulf is, like Hrothgar before, made impotent by having had sex with the monster. Yes. Yeah, and there's this golden horn that's kind of phallic, and like, you know, that's pretty obvious. And there's jokes about getting laid in the lair, and they're all innovations that change the story in a really super creative way. I really thought it was great.
And if you're a Beowulf fundamentalist, you'll end up hating this. It's
true, but why? Why be a fundamentalist?
Because Hrothgar, instead of being an old but once heroic figure,
he's horrible.
Is a womanizing alcoholic.
Terrible. And
one of the things that I learned, but just reading about the movie, Hopkins never read Beowulf.
Are you kidding?
You think of him as being, because of the posh accent, as being this Oxford or Cambridge.
Oh, right.
He isn't.
No. But I didn't know he hadn't read Beowulf.
He hadn't read Beowulf. He had no idea what this was, what he was in for.
Wow. And I guess what I mean by why be a fundamentalist Beowulf person? Because it's so much fun to hear the way that people can take this story and make it new. I just love it.
Yeah. And it does make it new. It's an interesting take on it. And I think that what the modern takes have is Grendel as the outsider.
Right.
The loneliness and the anger of the outsider, which made me think of Frankenstein.
Absolutely.
The monster.
Yeah.
The monster of the novel, in which, if John Gardner's Grendel is Sartre, it's also a retelling of the Frankenstein story.
Mm-hmm.
And the love-hate relationship that Frankenstein has with his creator. It's a love-hate relationship that Grendel has with the only beings who can speak, that he can communicate with, and those are the humans.
Yeah. So, and I think that when talking about inverting the monsters, obviously it's speaking to a worldview where talking about stories of inclusion and exclusion are very prominent. And, also talking about like, okay, well, where are the women that, more contemporary audiences would find resonating. And to find those things interesting is not to also find the warrior society of the early 700s interesting.
Exactly.
You can do it both and.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in order for a poem, a story to continue to be relevant, it has to be flexible enough to be able to accommodate the new interests, the new problems and issues of a different age.
Yeah.
And Beowulf has managed to be able to do that.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that the original is irrelevant, because the original itself is just such a damn good story.
It really is. And I was just going to say that kind of horror, it's very primitive, of this monster that can come and attack your safe haven and destroy it. I think that just resonates across time and space in all human cultures. Like, you can think of so many stories.
Definitely. And there's another timeless element to the poem. The original is about a hero, but it's also about the inevitability of age. The inevitability that even heroes will grow old and will die.
Right. Mm-hmm.
If Beowulf had ended with the triumph over Grendel, it would be a different story than ending with Beowulf's heroic, but ultimately his fatal engagement, and the fact that he will die.
Absolutely.
That we all die.
Yeah. I have a line from Seamus Heaney that really gets at that, and it's well before the end of the poem. So this is his translation of "Around the Lines 1,000" in the Kleber version. But death is not easily escaped from by anyone. All of us with souls, earth dwellers, and children of men must make our way to a destination already ordained, where the body, after the banqueting, sleeps on its deathbed.
Wow, that is such a cheery way to end a podcast,
right?
that will be the last word for it. Thank you for joining me with it on this.
Richard, thank you so much for having me. This was a delight.
I'm sure we're going to be doing more episodes in the future.
So.
Yeah.
Yes, it was great. I really thank you for having me.
And thank you all for joining us. We'll be back in the new year. So until then, happy holidays. Bye for now.